A rich man mocked his chauffeur's dreams, but years later, he's begging him for help. Richard Montgomery sat behind his polished mahogany desk in his office, the skyline of the city stretching endlessly before him. He had everything a man could want: wealth, status, power. His empire of luxury hotels and high-end real estate investments spanned across continents. Yet, despite all his success, Richard had always felt an emptiness inside, an ever-present gap between him and the rest of the world. It wasn't that he didn't appreciate his life. He did. It was just that, at times, he couldn't help but feel disconnected from the people around him, people he saw as beneath him, particularly those who worked for him. His chauffeur, Ethan Walker, was one such person. Ethan had worked for Richard for nearly 4 years. He had been hired when Richard's previous chauffeur had retired. Ethan had proven to be reliable, courteous, and efficient in his role. However, Richard had never considered him as more than a part of the background of his life. He was a hired hand, someone who existed solely to serve Richard's needs and help him maintain the life he had carefully crafted. Ethan had a habit of speaking up now and then. Nothing too bold, just the occasional comment or question. But Richard never paid much attention. The chauffeur was just that, someone who drove him around, cleaned a car, and helped when needed. One afternoon, Richard was in the back of his sleek black sedan, running late to yet another meeting. As the car sped down the busy streets, Ethan, ever the professional, kept his eyes focused on the road. But for once, Richard's attention was drawn to the young man sitting in the front seat, his eyes fixed ahead. "What's your plan, Ethan?" Richard asked, his voice carrying a touch of curiosity, though his tone remained distant. "What do you want to do with your life, aside from driving cars?" Ethan glanced briefly in the rearview mirror before speaking. "Well, sir," he said, choosing his words carefully, "I've always wanted to start my own business. Maybe a cafe or a small chain of stores. Something of my own, you know." Richard chuckled, his gaze shifting away from the window to look at Ethan in the rearview mirror. He raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by the notion. "A cafe?" Richard asked with a slight smirk, leaning back in his seat. "You've been working as my chauffeur for years, and you think you could run a business? What makes you think you can pull that off?" Ethan swallowed hard, but he refused to be intimidated. "I believe I could, sir. I've been learning a lot in my free time, reading business books, talking to people who've done it. I know it's not going to be easy, but I'm willing to put in the work." Richard laughed louder now, shaking his head. "You know, Ethan, that's cute. But let's be real here. You're a chauffeur, not a businessman. You're good at what you do, driving me around and looking professional. But running a business, that's a whole different world. It's not something people like you can just jump into." Ethan's face flushed slightly, but he held his ground. "I don't think I'm like everyone else, sir. I've got goals. I've got a vision." Richard leaned forward, his tone becoming more dismissive. "You may have goals, but dreams won't pay the bills. You're talking about a cafe like it's a simple thing to open. You've got no resources, no backing, and frankly, you don't have the know-how. People like you're meant to serve, not build. And that's fine. It's the reality of things." Ethan's grip on the steering wheel tightened. He had expected Richard's words, but hearing them out loud stung more than he anticipated. Despite the insult, he kept his voice steady. "I may not have the resources now, but I'm working toward it. I won't stop trying." Richard rolled his eyes, dismissing Ethan's words as childish. He leaned back in his seat, returning his gaze to the window. "Well, keep dreaming, Ethan. But don't expect any sympathy from me. Just remember your place." The silence in the car grew heavy as the minutes ticked by. Ethan focused on the road, his thoughts swirling. Richard's words lingered, cutting deeper than he had let on. He had always admired Richard, respected him even, but this moment, this dismissal of his dreams, felt like a punch to the gut. Still, he couldn't let Richard see how much it hurt. Richard, oblivious to Ethan's inner turmoil, continued to stare out the window, already distracted by the business meeting ahead. He had said what he needed to say, had reminded Ethan of his place. In his mind, that was the end of it. Ethan was just a servant. Nothing more. 2 years later, life, however, had a way of surprising even the most arrogant of men. Ethan had used Richard's mockery as fuel, as something to prove. Over the past 2 years, he had spent every free moment building his business. He took on side jobs, saved every penny, and learned everything he could about running a cafe. Slowly, his hard work began to pay off. He found a small location in a developing part of the city, built relationships with local suppliers, and eventually managed to open his cafe, a small but thriving establishment. Richard, on the other hand, had seen his empire begin to show cracks. The luxury hotels and real estate properties he once managed with ease were now suffering from mismanagement, outdated business strategies, and a faltering economy. Despite his initial arrogance, Richard could not ignore the mounting pressure. Investments that once made him millions were now draining his bank account. It was a slow unraveling, but it was happening. As the days passed, Richard's frustration grew. He tried everything to save his empire, restructuring deals, cutting costs, firing staff, but nothing seemed to work. His confidence was shaken, and he found himself retreating more and more into the walls of his mansion, wondering how he could get out of this mess. The call for help. One fateful evening, Richard's phone buzzed on his desk. He didn't recognize the number. At first, he ignored it, thinking it was just another solicitor. But something made him pause. A strange sense of desperation urged him to pick up. "Hello, Mr. Montgomery, it's Ethan Walker," came the calm voice on the other end. "I don't know if you remember me, but I used to work as your chauffeur." Richard's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't heard that name in over 2 years. Ethan? The young man he had mocked and dismissed? What could he want now? Richard couldn't hide the edge in his voice. "Ethan, what is this about?" "I know it's been a while," Ethan continued, "but I have something that I think could help you. I've been following your company's troubles, and I think I might be able to help." Richard's mind raced. Could it be? Did Ethan have some insight into his problems? Or was this just some misguided attempt at a sense of revenge? Either way, Richard couldn't ignore it. He had no other options. "What exactly do you think you can do for me?" Richard asked, trying to sound skeptical, though there was a hint of curiosity in his voice now. Ethan paused before responding. "I own a cafe now, Mr. Montgomery. It's doing well, and I've learned a lot about business, about branding, and about what it takes to get people to trust you. I think I have some ideas that could help you turn things around. But I need to speak with you in person." Richard's thoughts were clouded. This wasn't what he had expected. Ethan was offering to help, but the question loomed in Richard's mind. Could someone like Ethan really have the answers he needed? Was he truly capable of seeing beyond his previous mockery and finding a way to redeem himself? Richard took a long breath, leaning back in his chair, his mind working through the options. What choice did he have? "Fine. Come to my office tomorrow morning. I'll hear you out." Ethan didn't waste any time with pleasantries. "Thank you, Mr. Montgomery. I'll be there." The meeting. The following morning, Ethan walked into the towering building where Richard's office was located. The sleek marble floors, the lavish decor, and the gleaming windows overlooking the city all seemed so far removed from the modest cafe he now owned. He had come a long way from the days of being just a chauffeur, though, he thought, it was hard not to feel the sting of that past life still lingering at the edges of his mind. He was shown into the grand office by Richard's secretary, a woman who gave him a polite but distant look as she led him past the polished glass walls and the expensive artwork. The stark contrast between his humble beginnings and this world still struck him. As he entered Richard's office, he couldn't help but feel a sense of déjà vu. Richard's empire was collapsing around him, but the arrogance in his posture remained the same. Richard stood by the window, looking out over the city, his face creased with the tension of recent days. The weight of his business failure was evident in the slump of his shoulders, but when he turned to face Ethan, he still tried to maintain an air of authority. "You came," Richard said, his voice a little sharper than he intended, though there was an undertone of curiosity. He gestured to the chairs in front of his desk, a clear attempt to regain some control of the situation. Ethan took a seat, his posture composed but relaxed. He didn't rush. The years of striving and sacrifice had taught him the importance of patience. "I told you I'd come," Ethan said simply. His voice was calm, almost serene, but there was a quiet confidence in the way he spoke. "But I'll be honest, I'm not sure how much help I can be. You've built your empire on principles I don't agree with." Richard frowned slightly. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his brows knitting together. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving Richard's. "You built your wealth by treating people as tools to use. You saw me, a man doing honest work, as nothing more than someone to fill a role. And now that you've hit rock bottom, you come to me, someone you once mocked, asking for help." Richard bristled at the words, but Ethan's tone wasn't accusatory. It was matter of fact. It was a reflection of truth that Richard had long ignored. The arrogance, the power, the wealth. It had all served to blind him to what truly mattered. He had built an empire, but at what cost? I didn't come here to be lectured, Richard snapped. I need help, Ethan. You can either help me or leave, but don't stand there and judge me for things you don't understand. Ethan took a deep breath, letting the tension roll off him like water. He wasn't here to judge, not anymore. But he couldn't help the anger that bubbled beneath the surface when he thought of how Richard had once so carelessly dismissed him. Maybe I don't need to understand everything about you, Richard, Ethan said quietly. Maybe all you need to know is that the way you built your success isn't going to work for you anymore. It's not sustainable. People are starting to see that. The way you've treated them, used them, it's going to cost you. And it already is. Richard didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a long, hard look at Ethan, the weight of the conversation finally sinking in. What Ethan was saying was true, whether Richard liked it or not. The empire he had spent years building was crumbling because of his own mistakes. Mistakes he had refused to acknowledge. Mistakes that had alienated those who had once supported him. Ethan's quiet words cut through the surface-level pride Richard had hidden behind for years. It wasn't easy to admit that the man he had once seen as nothing more than a servant was now someone who could offer him the solutions he desperately needed. The first offer. Ethan didn't wait for Richard to speak. He had learned over the years that some people couldn't be convinced through words alone. Action had to come first. If you really want help, Richard, Ethan said, his voice firm, you're going to have to start listening. You can't keep thinking the way you always have. That's what got you into this mess. Richard remained silent, his mind spinning as he tried to figure out what Ethan was offering. Ethan's next words were the key. Your empire isn't just in trouble because of your business dealings. It's in trouble because of the way you've treated people, your employees, your partners, even your family. People don't trust you anymore, and no business can survive without trust. Richard stared at Ethan, trying to digest the truth in his words. He was right. The walls Richard had built around himself over the years had isolated him from the very people who had helped him reach the top. Now those walls were crumbling. Okay, Richard said, his voice thick with frustration. What do you suggest, Ethan? What's your big plan? You're the one who built a cafe, right? What makes you think you can turn around a multi-billion-dollar empire like mine? Ethan's gaze was unwavering. It's not about the size of the company. It's about how you approach people. You need to reframe your business strategy, focus on people over profits. Your luxury hotels, they're not the issue. They could thrive if you treat your customers, your employees, your partners with respect. That's what I've learned, Richard. It's about connection. Richard sat back in his chair, still skeptical, but something in Ethan's words resonated with him. A shift occurred within him, just a tiny crack in the fortress of arrogance he had built. I don't know if I can change that quickly, Richard admitted, his tone lower now, more vulnerable than before. It's not that simple. Ethan nodded slowly. It's not. But you have to start somewhere. The first step is being honest with yourself. The second step is acknowledging that people like me, people you thought were beneath you, have something to teach you. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, but there was no defensiveness in his gaze this time. Only a quiet curiosity. Ethan's sincerity was something Richard hadn't encountered in years, maybe ever. Ethan wasn't asking for money, fame, or recognition. He was offering something far more valuable, a chance to rebuild, to change. Ethan's offer. All right, Richard, Ethan continued, his tone steady. I'll help you. But it won't be easy. We'll start with rebuilding the trust you've lost. We'll work with your employees, your partners. But more importantly, we'll work with you. You're the one who needs to change if this empire is going to survive. People need to see that you're not just about profit, that you actually care about them. And that starts with you. Richard remained silent for a long moment, his hands clasped in front of him as he absorbed Ethan's words. He had spent so many years convincing himself that power and money were enough to keep the world in his control, but now he was faced with the reality that his empire could crumble if he didn't change. Ethan stood up, preparing to leave, but Richard stopped him with a hand. Thank you, Ethan, Richard said quietly, his voice strained. I don't know what this will look like, but I'm willing to try. Ethan's expression softened. You're welcome. But remember, actions speak louder than words. I'm not doing this for you, Richard. I'm doing it for the people who are depending on you to get it right. As Ethan turned to leave, Richard sat back in his chair, staring at the cityscape before him. For the first time in a long while, he felt the weight of his actions. And for the first time in a long while, he was open to the possibility of change. Ethan's strategic guidance. The following weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, adjustments, and uncomfortable truths for Richard Montgomery. He had always been a man who prided himself on control, on commanding every situation, but now, as he sat across from his employees, those same people he had once dismissed with ease, he realized how much he had taken them for granted. Ethan had started small. The first day they met to discuss the business strategy, Ethan didn't dive right into financials or projections. Instead, he talked about people. "You need to rebuild the trust you lost," Ethan had said. "And trust isn't something you can buy. It's something you have to earn." At first, Richard had balked at the idea. He was used to power, used to making demands that others obeyed. "I don't have time to babysit employees and rebuild relationships," Richard had protested. "I need numbers, I need action. Not therapy sessions." But Ethan didn't back down. "Start by listening," he had advised, "and let them know you've changed. Your employees need to know you see them as people, not just cogs in your machine. They need to see that you care about them." The first meeting Richard had with his senior staff was awkward, to say the least. His employees, who had once jumped to do his bidding, now seemed wary. They had seen Richard's arrogance firsthand, and now they weren't sure if this sudden shift in tone was real or just another act of self-preservation. Richard, dressed in his usual expensive suit, stood at the head of the conference table, staring at the faces of those who had been with him through thick and thin. The walls he had so carefully built over the years, the walls of superiority and pride, felt fragile now, like they might crumble under the weight of his guilt. "You've all heard about the recent changes," Richard began, his voice uncharacteristically humble. "I know that I've made mistakes. I've treated you as tools to my success, and for that, I'm sorry. But I want to change. I want to work with you, not above you." There was a long silence in the room, and for a moment, Richard thought his words had fallen flat. Then slowly, one of the employees, a middle-aged woman named Grace, spoke up. "It's going to take time, Richard. But if you're sincere, we're willing to try," Grace said, her voice firm but not unkind. Richard nodded. He didn't expect immediate forgiveness, but just hearing her words felt like the first step toward rebuilding something he thought was beyond repair. The humbling lesson. Days turned into weeks, and Richard continued to meet with Ethan, discussing business strategies, employee engagement, and customer relationships. At first, Richard struggled with the more personal elements of Ethan's advice. He wasn't used to discussing feelings, vulnerabilities, or making his employees feel valued. His instincts told him to focus on profits, on results. But slowly, he began to see that Ethan's approach wasn't just idealistic, it was practical. The key to success wasn't just about cutting costs or pushing forward with bigger, bolder investments. It was about understanding the people behind the numbers, his employees, his customers, and the communities his business served. He had been running his empire from the top down, but Ethan's guidance showed him the power of building from the ground up. One day, as they sat in Ethan's cafe, talking over lunch, Richard couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude for the young man who had once been nothing more than a simple chauffeur. The cafe, small as it was, felt full of life. Customers smiled at Ethan, and the warmth in the room was palpable. "This is your world now," Richard said, gesturing around the cafe. "You've built something from nothing." "I can't believe it." Ethan smiled modestly. "It's not easy, Richard. But when you believe in something, when you're doing it for the right reasons, it's worth it." Richard sat back, his gaze lingering on the bustling cafe. "You're right. And it's something I've missed. I've spent too long chasing after things that didn't matter. I thought I could control everything, but I see now I've been wrong." Ethan nodded, understanding. "It's never too late to change, Richard. But the change has to come from within. It's not just about your business, it's about who you are." The simplicity of Ethan's words hit Richard harder than anything else. He had spent so many years trying to control his destiny, to shape the world around him. But now he realized that it was the people in his life, his employees, his family, his customers, who had the power to shape him. Richard's realization. As the weeks passed, Richard's interactions with his employees became more frequent and personal. He made a conscious effort to walk the halls of his office, greet people by name, and ask about their families. For the first time, he was more than just a distant boss. He was a leader, one who cared about the people who made his company function. The transformation wasn't easy, but it was real. Richard could see the difference in the way his employees treated him now. The tension that had once filled the office, the mistrust and resentment, began to dissipate. It wasn't instant, but the shift was undeniable. And then came the moment that Richard had feared most, the meeting with the investors. Richard had always prided himself on being a tough negotiator. But now, with everything on the line, he realized that his usual tactics wouldn't work. The investors were skeptical, and the room was charged with tension. Richard could feel his old self, his arrogant, commanding persona, wanting to take over. But he knew he couldn't go back to that man. He had to face these investors as the person he was now, not the person he had been. "I know we've had some difficulties," Richard began, his voice steady but not forceful. "But I want you to know that I'm committed to making this work. And I'm not just talking about the business. I'm talking about the people in this company. We're focusing on rebuilding trust with our employees, improving customer relationships, and being a better partner in the community." The investors exchanged glances, their skepticism still evident. But Richard pressed on. "This company has been built on hard work, on relationships, and I intend to preserve that. So if you're willing to work with me, we'll rebuild. If not, we'll part ways. But either way, I'll be doing it with integrity, not just profit in mind." The room fell silent. Richard waited, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea if this would work, but he knew it was the only way forward. He had to take the risk. Finally, one of the investors spoke up, his voice cautious but intrigued. "I think we can work with that," he said. Relief washed over Richard, but there was something deeper, a sense of pride. For the first time, he felt like he had earned something through honesty and humility. Ethan's silent support. Ethan didn't need to be in the room to know that Richard was changing. He had been watching from the sidelines, offering guidance when necessary, but allowing Richard to make the hard decisions on his own. Ethan understood the power of change. He had witnessed it in his own life when he had decided to chase his dreams. But watching Richard go through this transformation was something entirely different. Ethan never asked for recognition. He never expected Richard to owe him anything. But seeing Richard take responsibility for his actions, acknowledging his flaws, and moving forward with integrity, this was enough for him. The final test. Weeks passed, and Richard's empire slowly began to stabilize. The luxury hotels and real estate properties were not quite where they once were, but they were moving in the right direction. He had made significant strides in repairing the company's reputation, and more importantly, his relationships with employees and investors. Then came the final test. Ethan had been running his cafe smoothly, expanding it and building a loyal customer base. But when a new opportunity presented itself, an expansion into a larger space that could rival the city's top eateries, Ethan found himself at a crossroads. To take the opportunity would mean risking everything he had worked for. But this time, he wasn't alone. Richard, who had now become a mentor to Ethan, didn't hesitate. "I'll help you," he said. "You've earned it. You built this with your own hands, and you deserve every chance to succeed." Ethan hesitated, then smiled. "I didn't need you to say that, Richard. But thank you." It was a quiet moment, one filled with mutual respect and understanding. Richard wasn't just helping Ethan for the sake of business. He was helping him because he had come to value Ethan, not for his status, but for the person he was. And Ethan, in turn, had forgiven Richard. He didn't need to hold on to the past any longer. The past had made him who he was, and the future was something they could build together. Ethan's leap of faith. Ethan stared out the window of his cafe, watching as the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the glass. The quiet hum of the morning traffic outside was the only sound that filled the space. The cafe, though still small, was flourishing. Customers came in regularly, some for the cozy ambience, others for the reputation it was slowly building as a new gem in the city's culinary scene. But Ethan knew that everything he had built could change in an instant. The opportunity that lay before him, the larger upscale space just a few blocks away, was both exhilarating and terrifying. The potential for success was immense, but so was the risk. It was everything he had worked for, everything he had dreamed of, and yet he couldn't help but feel the weight of the decision. "Good morning," Richard's voice broke through Ethan's thoughts as he entered the cafe. Richard had become a constant presence in Ethan's life, not as a benefactor, but as a partner, one who respected Ethan's vision and understood the challenges he faced. Despite the gulf in their backgrounds, they had formed a unique bond that transcended the past. Ethan looked up, offering a small smile. "Morning, Richard. I was just thinking." Richard took a seat at the counter, his usual warm smile tempered by a serious expression. "About the new place?" Ethan nodded. "Yeah, it's a huge opportunity, but also a huge risk. I've worked hard to get here, and I don't want to mess it up." Richard's gaze softened, and for the first time, Ethan noticed how much older Richard seemed. His features were no longer dominated by arrogance or arrogance, but by genuine concern and empathy. He had truly changed, and not just for show. The Richard who had once mocked Ethan's ambitions was now the Richard who sat with him, offering advice not out of obligation, but because he genuinely wanted to help. "You've already taken risks," Richard said, leaning forward. "The biggest risk was starting this cafe in the first place. You've built something from nothing, and that's not easy. This next step might seem like a leap, but it's just another challenge. And challenges, my friend, are how we grow." Ethan studied Richard for a moment. It wasn't the words themselves that mattered. It was the sincerity behind them. Richard, for all his past faults, had become someone Ethan could rely on. "I appreciate that," Ethan replied, "but it's not just the business. It's everything. I don't want to lose what I've worked so hard for. I'm not just taking a risk for myself. I'm doing this for the people who supported me, for the employees who believe in this place." Richard nodded. "And that's exactly why you'll succeed. You care about more than just the business. You've built relationships, Ethan. You've earned loyalty. People will follow you because they trust you." Ethan exhaled, feeling the weight in his chest ease slightly. He knew Richard was right. He wasn't just selling food or drinks. He was building a community, creating a space for people to gather, to share, and to connect. Still, the fear lingered in his stomach. "You're not alone in this," Richard said, sensing Ethan's hesitation. "I'm here. I'll help you however I can." Ethan looked at him, truly grateful for the offer, but also aware that he had to make the final decision on his own. He had come so far on his own, and while Richard had been invaluable in giving him guidance, the leap was his to take. After a long silence, Ethan spoke, his voice quiet but resolute. "I think I'm ready. I'll take the risk." Richard smiled, proud of the decision Ethan had made. "That's the spirit. You've got this." Richard's final test. Richard's efforts to rebuild his empire had not been without setbacks. Though he had begun to make changes, both personally and professionally, he still had to contend with the fact that not everyone believed in his transformation. Many of the older investors, some who had known him for years, were still skeptical. They saw his recent humility as a sign of weakness, not strength. The final test for Richard came in the form of a board meeting, a gathering with his major investors and stakeholders to present the next phase of his business model. The pressure was immense, and he felt his old habits bubbling to the surface. He had the numbers ready, the data to back his strategies, but something felt different this time. Richard had learned a lot over the past few months, but the truth was that he had never fully opened himself to his investors. They had always been numbers to him, just another obstacle to his success. Now, as he prepared to speak in front of them, he had to confront his own insecurities. Could he really pull this off? Could he show them that he was not the arrogant businessman he once was? The meeting started with the usual formalities. But as Richard took the stage, he felt an unfamiliar weight in his chest, not from the pressure, but from the vulnerability he was about to expose. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, his voice steady but filled with a sincerity he had never used before. "I stand before you today not just as the CEO of this company, but as someone who's learned the value of humility. I've spent years treating people as assets, not human beings, and I have paid the price for it." There was a murmur among the investors. Richard had always been a commanding presence in these meetings, but now his words were different. His eyes met theirs, not with the usual arrogance, but with a genuine openness. He wasn't here to command or impress. He was here to ask for something more: trust. "I know I've made mistakes," he continued, "but I'm asking for your support, not just because I want to turn this company around, but because I believe in the people who work for us, and I believe in the relationships we've built. I'm ready to put people over profits, to rebuild our reputation, and to lead with integrity." Silence filled the room. Richard could feel the weight of their scrutiny. The next words from his investors could make or break him. Then, one of the older investors spoke up, breaking the silence. "You've changed, Richard," he said slowly, eyes searching Richard's face. "And I think it's time we took a chance on that change." The room went quiet again, The tension thick in the air. "We'll support you," the investor said, "but you have to keep your word. No more arrogance. No more shortcuts. If you're really committed to this, we're with you." Richard nodded, his heart pounding. "Thank you. I won't let you down." It wasn't the roaring success he had once hoped for, but it was something more important. It was the beginning of trust. And trust, Richard knew now, was the foundation of every real success. The final step, partnership with Ethan. As the weeks passed, Richard continued to implement the changes he had promised. He made sure to treat his employees with respect, listen to their concerns, and acknowledge their contributions. Slowly, the company started to rebuild its reputation. Customers returned, investors warmed up to the new strategy, and Richard finally felt the weight of his old arrogance begin to lift. But the real transformation came when Richard began to embrace his partnership with Ethan. He wasn't just a businessman anymore. He was a mentor, someone who truly valued the people around him. Richard had learned to value not just profits, but the people who made those profits possible. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Richard walked into Ethan's cafe. The place was packed, buzzing with laughter and conversation. Ethan looked up from behind the counter and smiled when he saw Richard. "Business still booming?" Richard asked, a glint of pride in his eyes. Ethan nodded. "We're doing well. But it's not just about the numbers. It's about the people who come in and leave with a smile on their face." Richard chuckled, leaning on the counter. "Sounds familiar. Maybe I have something to learn from you after all." Ethan smiled back, understanding the deeper meaning behind Richard's words. "You've always had it in you, Richard. Sometimes it just takes a little help from the right people." Richard paused, his gaze softening. "And I'm glad I had you to help me along the way." As the evening wore on, Richard and Ethan stood side by side, watching the customers enjoying their meals, laughing and talking. It wasn't just about the cafe anymore. It was about the bond they had built, the trust they had shared. And in that moment, Richard realized that he had learned the most important lesson of all. True success wasn't about wealth or power. It was about the people you helped, the lives you touched, and the integrity you lived by. The final chapter, redemption and renewal. Months passed, and the landscape around Richard Montgomery had shifted drastically. His company, once in jeopardy, was now on the path to recovery. The press had started to highlight his change in leadership style. Richard, who had once been synonymous with arrogance, was now being recognized for his humility and focus on people over profits. Ethan's cafe, too, continued to grow. It had become a staple of the local community, a place where people came not just for the coffee, but for the atmosphere that Ethan had so carefully nurtured. Word of mouth spread quickly, and what had started as a small venture in a modest corner of the city now had customers lining up outside. One quiet afternoon, Richard walked into Ethan's cafe, the scent of freshly brewed coffee enveloping him. Ethan was behind the counter, as always, but today, there was a certain sense of pride in his movements, a quiet confidence that reflected the journey they had both been on. "You look like you've conquered the world," Richard remarked, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Ethan looked up, his face breaking into a grin. "I'm getting there. It's been a lot of work, but it's worth it. Every step." Richard walked to the counter, leaning against it casually, his gaze softening as he took in the vibrant energy of the cafe. "You know, Ethan, I've been thinking about how far we've both come. It's hard to believe sometimes." Ethan nodded. "I know. I never imagined I'd be standing here, running my own business and having a conversation like this with you." Richard chuckled. "Neither did I. I used to think I had everything figured out. Money, power, control. But the truth is, it was all hollow. What I've learned from you is that true success comes from building relationships, from treating people with respect." Ethan paused for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "It wasn't just me who changed you, Richard. You had to be ready for it. You had to want it." Richard's gaze met Ethan's, his eyes filled with sincerity. "And I'm glad I did. I can't say it was easy. It still isn't, but I'm trying. And for the first time, I feel like I'm doing something that actually matters. Not just for myself, but for the people around me." Ethan smiled, the words of wisdom Richard had shared now carrying weight and truth. He had watched Richard struggle with pride, with guilt, and with the responsibility of changing an empire. But he had also watched Richard grow, step by step, through the vulnerability of admitting his mistakes, learning how to connect with people, and ultimately leading his company with integrity. Change isn't a one-time thing, Ethan said, looking around at the cafe. It's a daily decision. And I think you've made that decision, Richard. Every single day. Richard nodded. I hope so. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I'll approach it differently now. And I'm ready for whatever comes next. The ultimate test. As spring turned into summer, Richard's company continued to grow. His reputation, once marred by arrogance and missteps, had become one of humility and perseverance. He was no longer the man who looked down on others, but someone who was building something meaningful, not just for himself, but for the people he worked with and community he had once ignored. But his real test came one evening when a major investor, someone from Richard's past, who had initially backed him, arrived at his office with some bad news. The investor had come to offer a final proposal for a potential buyout of Richard's company. The offer was substantial, but came with strings attached. Richard would have to sell, step down, and let someone else take over. For a moment, Richard thought about the years of hard work, the transformation he had gone through, and the way his company was now aligned with his values. The thought of selling out didn't sit well with him. Not after everything he had learned. Ethan was the first person he called. After all, it had been Ethan who had shown him the way. He had trusted him, supported him, and been the catalyst for change in his life. Ethan's voice on the other end of the line was calm, as it always was. What's going on? They want me to sell, Ethan. The investors want me to cash out, Richard said, his voice filled with uncertainty. It's a huge offer, but something doesn't feel right. This doesn't align with what I've been working toward. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he spoke. Do you want to sell, Richard? Is that what you really want? Richard let out a slow breath, realizing the depth of the question. He had spent so many years working for profit, for control. But now he realized it wasn't about the money anymore. It was about legacy. It was about building something that would last, something that would stand for the values he now held dear. No, Richard said, his voice strong. I don't want to sell. I worked too hard to build this the right way. Ethan smiled on the other end of the line, hearing conviction in Richard's voice. Then don't. You've got a team that believes in you now. You got a company that's in the process of turning itself around. Don't let anyone take that away from you. Richard felt the weight lift off his shoulders. Ethan's words were the validation he needed. It wasn't the money or the power that mattered. It was the path he had chosen. He wasn't going to give up on the people who had supported him. He wasn't going to give up on the values he had fought so hard to instill. The final decision. The next morning, Richard walked into the boardroom with newfound confidence. The investor sat across from him, waiting for a decision. Richard took a deep breath and stood tall. I've thought about your offer, Richard said, his voice firm, and I've decided that I won't be selling. This company is my legacy, and I'm going to see it through. I've learned that it's not just about the bottom line. It's about the people who make this company great. The investor frowned, clearly displeased. Are you sure about this, Richard? You're walking away from a significant offer. I'm sure, Richard replied. I've learned that the real value in life comes from what you give, not what you take. With that, Richard turned and left the boardroom, knowing that the decision he had made was the right one. Ethan and Richard's last conversation. Later that evening, Richard stood in front of Ethan's cafe, looking out at the bustling street. The weight of the decision was still fresh, but he felt a sense of peace he had never known before. Ethan stepped out from behind the cafe's counter, walking toward Richard with a calm smile. How did it go? Richard looked at him, a genuine smile on his face. I didn't sell. I'm keeping it. I'm doing this the right way, by leading with integrity. Ethan clapped Richard on the back. I knew you would. That's the Richard Montgomery I've always known was in there. You just had to see it for yourself. Richard's smile widened. Thank you, Ethan. You've taught me more than I could ever have imagined. You helped me see that true success isn't about power or money, it's about people. They stood there for a moment, side by side, watching as the world passed them by. It wasn't about the grand gestures anymore. It was about the quiet, steadfast belief that what they were doing mattered. I'm ready for the next chapter, Richard said, his voice filled with quiet confidence. Ethan nodded. Me too. Together, we'll make sure it's a good one. As they walked into the cafe, the doors closing behind them, it was clear that the future, though uncertain, held promise. Not just for Richard, but for Ethan, and for the legacy they would build together.